Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes just to allow the last few people to join. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes late. We were just having a frantic panic with technology. But yeah, we'll just give it a couple of minutes and then we'll be on the way. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it enough time. So welcome along to this ASFP webinar. Today, we're looking at fire doors for the passive fire industry. Joined today by Hannah Mansell, our technical author for our Green Book out of our technical group 10, which is looking at fire doors. So we've prepared a webinar for you this afternoon, which we're going to play. And after which, any questions, if you drop them into the chat, we'll pick them up at the end, and me and Hannah will discuss any questions that you've got. So without further ado, we'll jump straight in with the webinar.
Welcome to the Association for Specialist Fire Protection webinar, Fire Doors for the Passive Fire Safety Sector. My name's Hannah Mansell and I'm your speaker for today. I'm also the technical author for the ASFP Task Group 10 Fire Doors. The ASFP Task Group 10 Fire Doors is a collaborative sector effort designed to bring the industry together and create resources that will improve education, knowledge, and behaviours within the sector. I'm the technical author for the Green Book, Fire Door Systems, that will be launched later this year. In this webinar, we're hoping to focus in on some of the burning topics which are relevant for the passive fire sector. We're going to talk about the changing regulatory landscape and how to take a future-proofed approach. What are the considerations that people working in this sector need to be aware of? We're going to talk about the steps and the control processes associated with assuring the specification, the installation, and the life service of products within buildings. And underpinning all of that work, we want to talk about the paperwork trail, the documentation that sits in the background, the due diligence checks that need to be done before any work is embarked upon. Now, I can't possibly tell you everything that I know about fire doors in the next 40 minutes, so I'm hoping to signpost you towards sources of further information that you may find useful to extend your knowledge after this webinar. So before we get into the detail about fire doors and the passive fire safety sector, let's just take stock of the changing regulatory landscape that we're working within. Relevant to fire doors is the removal of the national classes in 2029 from Approved Document B in England. We also have the Building Safety Act and the Building Safety Regulator emerging and are expecting secondary legislation later this year. The defined roles and the duties of the clients, the principal designers, the principal contractors and the subcontractors are becoming clearer. Although fire doors have always been notifiable to building control, there seems to be a reawakening in this sector. And of course, competence seems to be the buzzword. How do we really assess and demonstrate the competence of organisations and operatives working within this sector? And then we have the pull on fire safety information, including information about fire doors within a building. And Regulation 10, the regular inspection of doors in the common areas, including apartment front doors. Now, I'd just like to show you a simplified graphic of the way that products and information travel through the fire door sector. I'm not going to read my way through this entire slide. You can do that. But really, I'd like to illustrate to you how many different points in the process, how many different stakeholders are involved, and how many different places things can go wrong. When you start a project and you actually start considering it from the perspective of the audience, the different stakeholders that are going to need access to your decisions, to your work, to your documentation, it's really important to consider all of these different groups and the type of information that they'll need. And one group I'd like to give an extra special shout out to is the end users, the residents, the visitors, the emergency services that will attend that building throughout its lifetime and keep it safe. They are often a forgotten group when we consider the fire door sector, but they should be first and foremost in our thoughts. Now, what I just showed you was a really simplified view of the fire door sector. Here's a little bit of an image that I did for a specific piece of work some years ago when I was tracing product. Now, there'll be no test on this slide, but I've included it to illustrate to you what a complex and intermingled web the fire door sector is. Products and components travel in all different directions, with all different sorts of servicing being done to them by all different sorts of stakeholders and at many levels of the chain. When we consider this image and we consider it against the backdrop of documentation that supports a product in its lifetime while it's fitted into a building, we must be considerate of all the different stages that that documentation and product may have passed through before it got to that building. Much of the information in today's webinar is based around commonly found fire door scenarios in both residential and some commercial settings. I'm talking about some of those more interesting buildings, maybe where we've got mixed use, a mix of retail, for instance, but with sleeping accommodation. As you can see, I'm starting to add in some aspects here that contribute to the overall risk profile of the building. Carrying on that theme of sleeping accommodation, we could be thinking about some educational scenarios or assisted living accommodations. It's important to note that the approach in a new building versus an existing building can be completely different. In an existing building, there may be a number of factors that need to be considered over and above the complications that you would deal with if you were just working in a new build type property. As we've previously mentioned, changing fire doors and the passive fire protection measures in a building are notifiable to building control. In this presentation, we haven't got time to delve into the heritage or listed type buildings and the approach to fire door safety in them. These are some of the most amazing projects to work on, but often they are dealt with in a case-by-case basis. So in this first part of the presentation, we want to express some foundation information about fire doors. So in the first case, what's their purpose? What do they do in an emergency? So fire doors are part of the passive fire protection compartmentation measures within a building. They're designed to delay the spread of fire and smoke and toxic gases around a building for a number of reasons. Number one, to keep the fire and the smoke in one place for as long as possible. Number two, to create the safe evacuation routes such as corridors or stairwells where occupants of the building may escape from the building. Fire doors are also used to create refuges in buildings. In some buildings, you might have a building with a very complex design. You might have a risk profile of occupant that would make it very, very difficult to do a safe and quick evacuation. And in those type of buildings, you may find a stay put fire plan. The creation of safe refuges within the building for those that cannot self-evacuate are all important until the fire can be brought under control. So we've talked about delaying the spread of fire, smoke and toxic gases. We've talked about creating refuges for those that can't self-evacuate. We've talked about keeping the escape routes clear for those occupants evacuating from the building, including the corridors and the stairwells. But one very important factor, which is often overlooked, is that the fire doors also keep the routes of ingress into the building safe for the emergency services who come to our aid when a fire breaks out. But it is so important not just to regard the performance of a fire door in that emergency of a fire. Doors provide multiple performance characteristics. This could be the thermal performance, privacy, the security and safety of property and people. There are some elements of fire door specification that are key to functionality, the accessibility attributes, the acoustic protection, the safety and use and communication attributes that fire doors can also offer. Now, all of these other performance characteristics, and by the way, this isn't an exhaustive list, they need to be considered in a holistic manner alongside the fire and smoke leakage performance attributes of the product. To consider one performance characteristic above another one or at the cost of another one will be detrimental. The design and specification of fire door products should be from a holistic approach, accounting for all the required performance characteristics. Gosh, this looks like a wordy slide, doesn't it? Well, don't worry. This webinar is being made available so that you can go and have a detailed read through afterwards. But I just wanted to express to you, this is just a taste of the standards, the guidance and the regulations that exist in the passive fire and fire door sector. It's important to understand the existence of these different documents and what they require you to do. I've listed some here which are the test standards for both fire and smoke, some relevant and probably familiar to you, such as PAS 24, the Enhanced Security Standard. But standards like BSEN 14351, the harmonised standard that allows an external door set to be CE or UKCA marked. And as we talked previously, the multiple performance characteristics of doors, we need to consider the performance of the weather tightness, acoustic, operation and strength, safety, and we also need to consider installation. Installation is as important as the specification of the product, and a poor installation will mean poor performance in life service. Towards the bottom of this slide, I've just summarised a few of the regulatory items that are relevant to the fire door sector as well. The Construction CDM Regulations 2015 that defines the different roles of principal designer, principal contractor and client. The Building Safety Act that drives home the responsibilities of those different stakeholders. And the General Product Safety Regulations, the controls in place, the mitigating risk factors of placing products on the market in the UK. So the previous slide was literally just a taste of some of the guidance and standards that exists in the fire door sector. But I thought it might be useful to highlight to you that external fire door sets, in this case, a harmonised standard has been published, so they may be CE marked or UKCA marked under the construction product regulation. Now, in this case, we would expect product to be presented to the market with a declaration of performance that will detail the performance attributes of the product. Now, remember, we're dealing with multiple essential characteristics here: fire integrity, fire insulation, the ability to self-close, ambient smoke leakage, thermal transmittance, acoustic performance, etc. We would also expect these products to be accompanied by on-product marking that would probably include a summary of the performance characteristics and attributes that the product could deliver. In the background, we'd expect to see a certificate of constancy of performance from the manufacturer that confirms that they have got the controls in place to consistently manufacture the specification again and again and again. And just a point of information for you, the transition to UK CA mark or UK NI mark from CE marking was due to expire in June 2025. Now, this date has been delayed further. However, we understand that it is not indefinite, so we are closely watching this space. On the previous slide, we started to talk about how products are presented to the market. On this slide, I thought it was useful for me to pull out 3 key terms for you: the test report, an assessment, and third-party certification. All these things are different, and unfortunately, we often see these words being used interchangeably. So the first one, the test report. This is literally the documentation of turning up at a test laboratory one day and passing a test or failing a test. In essence, it's a snapshot in time. It doesn't really show that a manufacturer could return to their factory production facility and produce a consistent specification of product again and again. However, primary test evidence is important because it helps to build an assessed scope that will be allowed. Now, moving to assessments. Assessments are done in a number of different ways. It can be expert judgment. It could be to a set of agreed extended application rules, EXAC rules. However, assessments are used to extend the scope of what has been tested. To carry out an assessment, they must be based upon the primary and secondary test evidence tested on a robustly sampled product. Assessments are a technical justification based on test evidence and potentially empirical knowledge within the sector. The test evidence that an assessment is based upon is critical. It must be recent, relevant, and reliable to base the decision on. And the competency, the controls, and the checking and the oversight of the individuals and the organisations that carry out assessments are key. Now, I've used this word assessment again and again, but just to drive down into a little bit further detail, there are all different types of assessments. There are assessments that are standalone assessments. They might be project specific or product specific. There are also assessments which form part of the scope offered by third-party certification, the extended scope. Just before we move away from assessments, you might want to refer to the example below. This is a simplified example for you, but what it's trying to demonstrate is that by going and achieving the complex test evidence that supports the complex design shown at the top of the screen, you may find a body or an individual that would allow a manufacturer to cover all of the different types of configurations shown below from one single test. So now let's just move on to third-party certification. In the UK, there are a number of different third-party schemes for fire door manufacture, installation, maintenance, and servicing. These third-party certification schemes are voluntary and they have a number of different rules. However, they are based on providing stakeholders with layers of assurance on top of a test report or just an assessment. Third-party certification is based upon the ability of a manufacturer to be able to prove that they have a controlled process in place and competent operators to deliver consistency every time they do the process. The processes are audited by an external third party, and there are other attributes to consider, such as traceability of product. And now let's just delve into product traceability a little bit further. On the screen here, I've pulled together just a few examples of product traceability, all taken from real life situations, seeing these products and labels in use in service. Now, a couple of notes around product traceability. Product traceability is not just the on-product marking, although this can be a helpful tool in product traceability. But the ones that I'm showing you here on screen, they actually provide the user with different bits of information. It's important to understand what the traceability is offering you and what additional attributes it's offering you as well. Just before we move away from this slide of product traceability, it's important to also consider that there are a number of scenarios where one might want to enact product traceability on a product. It could be related to the raw materials or components going into a design or a building, or it could be related right at the other end to appearing at a building and wanting to trace and understand the product that you've got installed in there. So as you can see, depending on the scenario, product traceability can offer more or less. It's important to consider product traceability and the controls that you will put in place, which are often complemented by some of this on-product labelling. And now, getting on to some of the bits which are a little bit more complex. When we think about fire doors, we need to be considering the paperwork trail, the due diligence checks that sit behind any decision which is made in the process or planning or execution of passive fire protection works within a building. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a number of examples of documentation, including those sampling reports, primary test evidence reports, because these could be plural, declarations of performance, third-party certificates and data sheets, possibly standalone assessments. And these are just some of the information that will sit in the background and should be made available to stakeholders so that they can verify a performance claim of a product and also make an informed decision. On the right-hand side of the screen are all different pieces of documentation that, for example, we might see in a real live project. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about the holistic approach to fire door works in buildings, but I just want to highlight it quite nicely with this slide, particularly on the right-hand side. If you read through all of these different pieces of information, you'll probably note that they are all coming from different sources. So it's important to do the due diligence stages at the beginning of a project before any selection or decision is made to ensure that you have got a full picture of the requirements and that you can meet those requirements. Right, excellent. We've got through the first part of this webinar, the foundation information that I thought would be useful to those working in the passive fire safety sector. In this next part of the presentation, section 2, I'd like to take you through a holistic approach, the considerations, the approach, the different stakeholders involved, the different decisions made, and the different pieces of documentation that will help support those decisions. In this next section, we were really minded that the listeners of this webinar may be working in a load of different scenarios within buildings. It could be new buildings, it could be existing buildings. It could be in a scenario of monitoring an existing fire door building stock, regular interval inspection, emergency replacements. They may be working in a context of providing identification for the products which are installed within a building, or creating and delivering the maintenance or upgrade plans required to bring these up to code. In other scenarios, operatives may be undertaking other passive fire protection works, such as running services through buildings or updating other elements of the building fabric that could have an impact on the fire door safety within a building as well. We touched on building type previously and did consider how a different approach may be needed depending on the building that you're working in. But in this slide, I'd just like to bring that together with the risk profile of the building as well. It's important to consider that fire doors shouldn't be considered in isolation within a building. They are part of the passive and active fire protection measures within a building that need to work hand in hand should an emergency occur. On projects where the fire doors are viewed too much in isolation, in my experience, I have seen blinkered decisions being made, potentially with impact to other measures within the building. Another point which is important is to consider the intended building type and the intended use, even down to the specific location within a building. For example, a cross-corridor door is a fundamentally different product than a locked service cupboard door. And again, that's a fundamentally different product in comparison to a fire door that you may have on your kitchen within an apartment. To understand the intended use and the location can really start to delve in and scratch away at the surface to understand how the building is operating as a total system. It will also allow you to make informed decisions should you need to do upgrade, maintenance or replacement works. We talked about multiple performance characteristics multiple times previously, but at these early stages of the project, consider the other performance characteristics. As we've discussed before, there is not one performance characteristic that should take precedence over another. Consider them all and come up with a specification that truly answers the requirements. Now, in a building, we also need to consider the building risk and occupant risk profile. Now, this is often outside of the specialisms that are delivered by passive fire safety protection companies or organisations. And this is where it leads on to a holistic approach dealing with a multidisciplinary force team that will approach the fire door issue within a building. Now, when we were creating this webinar, we were really conscious that the listeners of it may be coming from all different sectors of the passive fire protection world. But these rules here, this guidance, we hope it's useful, and it doesn't matter which scenario you're playing in. But we'd like to talk first about the collection of data. In whichever scenario you're working within a building, whether it be inspection, installation, maintenance works or upgrade works or change of use, the collection of data is key. And this is a key stage that should take place before really anybody steps on site and starts to carry out any physical work. It's this collection of data which can inform the scope of works and the planning and the controls needed to deliver and execute a successful project. Now, in existing buildings, this could be quite an onerous procedure. We need to locate existing sources of data, which could include the specification of the product which is already in there, the way that it was installed, the materials or the methods. But in essence, it may be looking even further than that. We may be wanting to reference different documentations such as the fire risk assessment for the building, the fire strategy for the building, or the compartment drawings. We may be looking for the fire door history, the age, the product identification, and the maintenance recordings. And just before we move on, let's stick with this subject of the collection of data and consider the value of invasive inspections, particularly in existing buildings. To carry out only visual inspections can be somewhat limiting, particularly if you are considering how different compartmentation is maintained within the building. It's often in these scenarios that the time paid to carry out small invasive inspections of the building can pay off later, as it will allow you to properly plan and account for the works that are being proposed. One of the very first stages of a project should be about stakeholder engagement and considering how you will approach this. Now, when we talk about stakeholders, cast your mind back to that chain of stakeholders that we talked about in section 1, many of them with different needs, different requirements, and different timings that they will participate in decisions. You should consider a multidisciplinary stakeholder team to deliver the range of competences and specialisms that may be required for each of the projects that you deal with. You should consider that the roles and responsibilities of these individuals should be clearly defined and laid out in a plan of decision making and sign off. Everyone clear about the timing of decisions and who is responsible for making them within the project team. And just a point here, in existing buildings, this stakeholder engagement should include the residents' voice at the earliest possible stages to ensure that the most suitable and satisfactory undertaking of works can be done. Consider the different communication methods that you'll need and consider the different types of information that will need to be made available to the different stakeholders at each different stage of the process. All too often, I have seen knee-jerk reactions to passive fire protection within buildings being made that have cost dearly in the long run. What I'd like to guide our listeners to today is taking the time at the beginning of the project. We've talked about doing potential invasive surveys, the collection of data that needs to be undertaken. And really, this is so that all of the stakeholders can agree the scope of works and start to plan them. Now, the overall lesson of this slide is that upfront planning will really deliver you dividends. You should consider the timings, the contingencies, the different people involved and their competence that they may need to demonstrate. You need to consider how you will engage and liaise with the other stakeholders. As we've talked about in the previous slide, some of that documentation that will be need to be made available to inform their decisions. It's also important to plan the whole process and include the documentation of works and checks that are undertaken, the sign-off processes by supervisors, and then the sign-off processes by the multidisciplinary stakeholder group. At these very, very early stages of the project, you should already be considering and formulating the list of handover information that will be required at the end of a project. Once the scope of work has been agreed, the project detailed planned, and the competence of those involved confirmed, you can undertake the works in the building. But I'd like to highlight the importance of documenting the work, creating the living record that will contribute to the golden thread of building safety information after the works are completed. Now, for each different project, the different documentation and checks that may be required can differ, but this should be planned out early depending on the scope of the works. A few important points that I'll call out on this slide. Considering the specification of product, the scheduling, the delivery, the handling requirements, the contingencies which need to be built in there, the competence of the operators and whether any specific training needs to be undertaken regarding the specific process or works that are being undertaken on a particular project. How you've engaged and liaised with the residents and what are the contingencies there. How can you access product information and manufacturer installation information up front? And the sign-off processes. Now, the handover of information should come as no surprise to anyone working on a passive fire protection or fire door project. Handover of information is key to enable the product to be serviced, maintained, and looked after throughout its life service. Knowledge about the fire door protection measures within a building are critical, knowing how to report concerns, mitigate them before they become a really huge problem, and actually save money. The planning of the handover of information should start at the very early stages of the project, considering all of the different stakeholders and what information they'll need. How will that information be accessible, be secure, not just now, but in a few years' time? And consider the audience receiving the information. We talk about fire doors every day, but some may not be so familiar. Some information needs to be made Some information really needs to be tailored to optimize the communication and comprehension by stakeholders. Some information really needs to be tailored to optimize the communication and comprehension by stakeholders. And just before we sign off for today, let's touch upon the competence of individuals and the capabilities of the organisations involved in passive fire protection works. Within our sector, we are seeing the emergence of competence frameworks for individuals. These are tailored by different processes, tasks, functions and activities that an individual may undertake, and considers the different ways that they may demonstrate them, the essential magic mix of skills, knowledge, experiences and behaviours. The ASFP would encourage our stakeholders to get involved in the competence framework conversations and make use of some of the freely available resources, such as the Competence Framework, which is hosted on the ASFP website. It's a free library of information, not just available to our members, but to our wider stakeholder network as well, that is full of useful information about how to bring and scale the competence conversation to your organisation and your individual role. For those working on passive fire protection projects or fire door safety works within a building, it is also important to consider the competence of the individuals and operators that are going to be involved in your projects. These should be intrinsically linked to the roles, the responsibility and the decision-making capabilities of those individuals to ensure that they can demonstrate the right skills, knowledge, magic mix of experience and behaviours that are required to deliver success and safety in this space. Okay, so before we sign off for today and present you a case study to illustrate some of the themes that we've talked about, let's just talk about some key learnings. The product, the performance characteristics, the people and the paperwork. So moving swiftly on. So key learnings around product from today. Consider those performance characteristics and consider it in a 360-degree holistic view. Early engagement with the supply chain, your multidisciplinary stakeholder group of those that will probably contribute information and decisions to a fire door safety project within a building. Think about those up front and avoid the costly delays later on. Ensure that you allow the time within your project to carry out the due diligence, the deep dive searches for data that will support your decisions. Don't be complacent, don't assume anything, and always check specification and the associated paperwork. Unintended consequences. Look both ways, particularly when dealing in unfamiliar buildings or those that have got a complex risk profile. And product traceability. We spoke about on-product traceability markings, but traceability of product and process goes so much further. In planning any project, you should be considering the traceability attributes and the different scenarios where you may need to use traceability to inform your decisions and how you would get your hands upon that data quickly. All too often, I have seen one performance characteristic take precedence over another one when we consider a fire door. This is a really, really dangerous approach. There is no hierarchy of performance characteristics. There is, however, a lot of work that can be done up front to deep dive into the requirements and the specification to meet the intended purpose, to place a product in a building that is fit for purpose for the specific use. I won't read my way through all of these performance characteristics, but I'd like the key learning from this slide to be: consider these points holistically and don't just go after one at the great cost of another. And now for one of the most important facets of managing fire door safety, considering the people. So considering and understanding the requirements of the end users within a building is critical, not just getting specification right on new product, but in helping you to design works in existing buildings, whether they be upgrade, maintenance, or replacement works. The last thing that you want to do is spend the money and the time carrying out works that are then proved to not be fit for purpose to meet the requirements of the end users in the building. At the beginning of your projects, you should also be considering how you would engage and the preferred communication methods for the different stakeholder groups. Consider your residents' engagement plan and the feedback loop processes and continuous improvement processes that you want to have embedded in your process. The method of reporting concerns will be extremely important to end users of the building, and the information from an education and awareness perspective that they would need as well. And just a final sign off to that paperwork trail that underpins almost every decision that we make. The paperwork collection and recording and documentation starts very early in the project, and time needs to be built into a project to be able to do this exercise. Much of that same information will form key parts of the handover information that should be handed to the end users who are expected to manage the building safely throughout its lifetime. This paperwork trail is absolutely key to going back and assuring oneself of the decisions and safety measures that are fitted within a building. They are absolutely critical to getting a project right and being able to prove it. So before we finish today, I would like to introduce you to a case study to illustrate some of the themes that we've talked about today. Although this case study happened a number of years ago, it is an example of how things can really go wrong when the passive fire protection measures in a building are not maintained or thought about. As I said, it would be impossible for me to tell you everything that I know about fire doors in just these 40 minutes. So I would also like to signpost you towards sources of further information and guidance before we go into our Q&A session. In July of 2009, a small fire started in Lakanal House. Lakanal House was an 11-storey building in Southwark in London that was built in the 1960s and contained around 100 flats. The building layout was interesting, complex, some might say. However, what started as a small fire that should have been put out very, very quickly turned into something that was completely out of control. In little under 2 hours, 6 lives had been lost and the building mostly destroyed. Although the image on the screen is showing you the outside of Lakanal House, there are a few elements to pick up on. Number one, the fire washed its way throughout the inside of the building. There was little to stop it because there was so much of the passive fire protection system that was breached. The fire also spread down the external face of the building as well. So this combination of reactions coming together on that fateful afternoon resulted in the loss of life of 6 innocent people who lived in Lakanal House. Now, Lakanal House is a detailed account of what could really go wrong, but maybe some of the elements that are all too familiar for those which are working in passive fire protection these days. There's a huge amount of information still posted on the Lambeth Council website regarding the coroner inquests of the victims of Lakanal House. An important lesson and case study for anyone working in the passive fire sector. Fire doors are really complex products, and depending on where you're working or applying them, the complexity can just multiply. We hope that this presentation today has provided some level of basis foundation information to highlight some of the considerations that you should undertake prior to approaching any work in any building. Much of the hard work done up front to plan a project will lead to successful execution when it comes to it. We'd like to signpost you towards the Green Book Fire Door Systems, which is coming out later this year, which is also accompanied by a number of different playbooks, which are tailored to meet the needs of different roles and individuals working within this sector. We also have a number of resources on the ASFP website, including the Competence Framework, a free library of competence resources designed to be made available to improve and continuously update competence levels within this sector. Thank you for attending our webinar today, and we'll move into the quick Q&A session now. We've had rather a lot of questions.
Hi everyone, hope you enjoyed that. While we open up the floor to any questions that might be coming in, one thing I do want to mention is that we have a few events coming up over the next couple of months. So coming up first, we've got a Liverpool seminar on the 18th of March. We've got a seminar in Ireland on the 25th of March. We've got our annual general meeting, which is taking place in London this year on the 8th of May. And then finally, we've got our Scotland seminar, which is taking place on the 20th of May. More information can be found on our website for those. If you head over to asfp.org.uk, you can have a look at those. And we have had some questions come in, so Hannah, I think I'll ask the questions.
Lovely. Okay. So the first one is, what is the anticipated publication date for the Green Book? You may add some, go for it. Thank you.
The Green Book, we've got a tentative publish date of November of this year. We're hopeful that we can hit that target, but however, with these things, that's not always the case. But that's the target that we're working for inside of the task group at the minute. And hopefully we get some other bits out before that date as well, whether that be advisory notes or any other technical support as well.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, so another one. Why does the secondary leaf on an uneven pair of doors, why is it allowed to have a flush bolt to lock the door? So I don't know what specific door our listener is actually looking at and considering, but it's quite common for a flush bolt to be included and allowed within certificated fire doors. I guess the best advice here is to always check the provenance of that door and that the certification allows for a flush bolt to be included, but it's actually sort of quite a common configuration that I come up against. And then the last question, why do smoke doors generally have to achieve a 3mm gap for cold smoke when the British standard test procedure has the door thresholds taped up? So yes, quite a lot in that question there. So the first part regarding the size of the gap, I think that the sort of due diligence checks that you should check before assuming a 3mm gap is to track your way back to the manufacturer's test and certification data, which will include the gaps, not just at the sides of the door, but the head and the threshold as well. The second part is the listener sort of highlights an oddity within the test method of taping the threshold gap up. That is not counted within the overall leakage rate, but as the industry actually moves, and many of them have already, to testing to the EN standards, that actually allows a few test configurations where the threshold would not be taped up, and that leakage is taken into the calculation as well. It's a good question, that one. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a couple more that's still coming in. You're not going to run away that quickly. So in terms of CPD certificates, you can apply for your CPD certificate if you email info@asfp.org.uk. They're only available if you've attended in person. If you're watching after the effect on our YouTube or on our website, that's not applicable to you, unfortunately. Question here, do you have to notify replacement of a fire door to building control?
Yeah, so this is around like if you're doing any works which will affect the passive fire compartmentation or the current fire strategy of that building. I think the listener, they may be asking actually quite a leading question there, which might be linked to, but how do you do that when you've got an emergency replacement? So I think a practical approach is sort of always required, and it's really important to maintain that building with the fire safety protection that's in it. So actually often emergency works need to be considered and a process for that. I work with a few stakeholders that have got sort of processes that sit in the background that make sure that they have got emergency replacement product actually really accessible to them, so that if it happens, they can move through that process pretty quickly.
Well, moving on, is there a final date set for when BS 476 as a test standard will expire?
So probably the date to really highlight to people is September 2029,
Yeah.
when 476 will be removed from approved document B, but in England. So it's important to note it's only within that context. I think that in some cases, remember that 476 isn't just used for fire doors, it's actually used for a whole other range of products. Some that actually don't have a European framework and test method that sit behind them already. So I think that 476, reference to it will still actually hang around for a while as the whole sector transitions over. I don't think it will be sort of an instant turn it off.
I will see. How does the scope of the Green Book compare to the British Standard Code of Practice for timber fire doors?
I think our listener there is probably talking about BS 8214, which is actually at the moment it's going through a rewrite and an update. So I think that the scope of the Green Book, although we've been very minded, particularly of the new definitions which are coming through in 8214, the Green Book is actually sort of extending itself out and looking particularly at the design specification stages and then throughout the whole life of the product. So I would see these as maybe not different, but complementing each other.
How does the, we spoke about that one. Are we working in collaboration with other trade associations such as the FPA or the DHF? Assuming this is the question around Task Group 10, yes, we are. Certain trade bodies have been invited and attend the meetings regularly, and that will continue on for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think sort of on that point, part of Task Group 10 being set up is to encourage industry collaboration. So actually we're really open to being approached by other organisations and individuals that can add their expertise to the group as well.
Yeah. Is there any guidance from ASFP on the percentage of invasive inspections to be conducted as a good rule of thumb? Obviously dependent on risk profile, etc. I think when it comes to inspections, ASFP, we always advocate for 100% inspections. While that's might not be possible for various reasons, in lieu of that, what should be happening is what's been agreed between all parties involved in the installation of, in this case, a fire door. So everyone needs to be aware of what the inspection process is going to be and be in agreement. And then you can move forward from there.
Okay, Adam, I think this one's going to be our last question to finish on time.
Yeah.
We've got a few more questions coming through, so actually we'll endeavour to go and reply to those after this, or maybe bring them up, sort of bring them into the Green Book even. But the last one, so sort of some common defects that we need to look out for when inspecting fire doors. Gosh, we could probably do a presentation just on that. So what I would say is that actually within the industry, there is some very good advice about the type of quick checks that you potentially could do. But I think that one good point around this inspection of fire doors is when I look out into the fire door landscape, there are all sorts of individuals and organisations offering fire door inspection. Those services can really depend on what end. That some of them can be massively deep with invasive surveys, 100% inspection of invasive, but other ones could be just a quick check to make sure ironmongery is in place and there's no wear and tear damage. I think for our listeners, it's important to be cautious that there is some real extremes of inspection. And if you're commissioning inspection services or considering, conducting them, consider what you need to get from it and make sure that you're engaging the right level of individual or organisation to do the job there.
Perfect. So we are out of time, unfortunately, today. However, if your question hasn't been answered and you'd like it to be, if you had dropped the question on an email to info@asfp.org.uk, and either myself or Hannah will get back to you with an answer on that. In the meantime, thank you everyone for joining. Hope you have a nice day, and we'll see you on the next one.